The Meridian restaurant glowed like a jewel against the city's twilight, its crystal chandeliers spilling warm light across polished marble floors. The air carried the delicate clink of silverware and the murmur of affluent voices, each table a stage for power plays and whispered deals. At the corner table, Michael Carter moved with practiced grace, balancing a tray of champagne flutes while his eyes scanned the room. 25 years old, with a lean frame and a calm that belied his youth, he was invisible to the elite diners, another waiter in a sea of pressed white shirts. But Michael saw everything, especially the woman at table 12, her manicured fingers flipping through a thick contract with the intensity of a predator. Elizabeth Harper, 42, was a name synonymous with triumph. As CEO of Harper Technologies, she had clawed her way from a modest startup to a tech empire, her face gracing Forbes covers and TED Talk stages. Tonight, her auburn hair was pulled into a severe bun, and her navy blazer strained against her rigid posture. The $200 million merger agreement before her was the culmination of 2 years of sleepless nights, and every clause felt like a brick in the legacy she was building. But the pressure had frayed her nerves, and when Michael approached to refill her water, her eyes snapped to him with a flicker of irritation. "Careful," she said, her voice sharp as she shielded the contract. "This is not a playground." Michael nodded, his expression neutral. "Apologies, ma'am." He stepped back, but not before his gaze caught a line on the open page, a termination clause, dense with legal jargon. His pulse quickened. He recognized the phrasing, the kind of ambiguity that could unravel fortunes. He had seen it before, in the predatory leases that had bankrupted his mother's corner store, in the loan agreements that had buried his family in debt. But he said nothing, returning to the kitchen with the tray, his mind racing. Inside the bustling kitchen, the air was thick with the scent of seared steak and fresh basil. Michael set the tray down, catching the eye of James Peterson, the restaurant's manager. James, a wiry man in his 50s with a perpetual sheen of sweat on his brow, clapped Michael's shoulder. "You good, kid?" "Harper's in a mood tonight." "She's always in a mood," Michael said, his voice low but steady. He glanced through the kitchen window, watching Elizabeth underline a paragraph with a red pen. The contract's flaws gnawed at him, but he knew better than to speak out of turn. "Not yet." Back in the dining room, Elizabeth's frustration boiled over. She slammed her fist on the table, the impact rattling plates and silencing the room. Heads turned, forks paused mid-air. The contract pages fluttered, one sliding to the floor at Michael's feet as he passed with a coffee pot. He knelt to retrieve it, his fingers brushing the fine paper, and before he could stop himself, the words slipped out. "There's an inconsistency in the termination clause," he said, his voice soft but clear. "The language could allow the other party to void the deal without penalty." The silence deepened, every eye on Elizabeth. Her face flushed crimson, her lips curling into a sneer. "Excuse me?" She leaned forward, her voice a venomous whisper. "You were reading over my shoulder while pouring coffee? What kind of establishment is this?" James materialized at the table, his hands clasped nervously. "Mrs. Harper, I am so sorry. Michael, kitchen now." But Michael did not move. He stood, the contract page still in his hand, his dark eyes meeting Elizabeth's with an unsettling calm. "I was not spying," he said. "I saw the clause. It is vague enough to let the seller walk away with your deposit. 20 million, if I'm not mistaken." Elizabeth laughed, a brittle sound that echoed through the room. "A waiter playing lawyer. How quaint." She snatched the page from his hand, waving it like a flag. "Very well, Professor. If you are so smart, translate this entire contract into words a child could understand. Right here, right now, in front of everyone." The challenge hung in the air, sharp and electric. Diners leaned closer, some pulling out phones to record. James shifted uncomfortably, but Michael's expression did not waver. He took the contract from her outstretched hand, his fingers steady. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice low, almost a warning. "Because once I start, I will not stop." Elizabeth crossed her arms, her smile predatory. "I am counting on it." "Let us see what you are made of." Michael opened the contract to the first page, his eyes scanning the text with a familiarity that sent a shiver through Elizabeth's spine. He began to read aloud, his voice clear and deliberate. Clause 1. Transfer of assets in the amount of $217 million upon regulatory approval. He paused, looking directly at Elizabeth. "In plain English, your company is buying another for $217 million, but only if the government says yes." Elizabeth's smirk faltered, a knot forming in her stomach. "Anyone can read the first line," she said, her voice tighter now. "Continue." Michael turned the page, his calm unshaken. Clause 2. 90-day audit period with unrestricted access to accounting records and intellectual property. He glanced up, his gaze piercing. Translation: You have 3 months to uncover the other company's secrets. But the next part is where it gets dangerous. The room seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. Elizabeth felt a bead of sweat on her palm, but her expression remained hard as stone. Michael's words were a spark, and the night was about to ignite. The Meridian restaurant pulsed with a new energy, its elegant calm fractured by the weight of Michael Carter's words. Crystal glasses caught the chandelier light, casting fractured prisms across the faces of diners who leaned forward, their whispers swallowed by the tension. Michael stood at Elizabeth Harper's table, the $200 million merger contract open in his hands, his voice steady as he dissected its clauses. Elizabeth, her auburn hair glinting like polished copper, gripped the edge of her chair, her knuckles pale. The challenge she had issued, translate the contract for all to hear, now felt like a trap of her own making. Michael turned to the third page with deliberate precision, his finger tracing a dense paragraph. "Termination clause for adverse material change," he read, his tone calm but edged with purpose. He looked up, meeting Elizabeth's eyes. "In plain language, the other company can cancel the deal if market conditions shift. But here is the problem, Mrs. Harper. The clause does not define significant. It could mean a 5% dip or a 50% crash. That ambiguity lets them walk away with your $20 million deposit as compensation." A murmur rippled through the dining room, forks abandoned as diners exchanged glances. Elizabeth's face tightened, her breath catching. She forced a scornful laugh, but it sounded hollow, like glass on the verge of breaking. "You are speculating," she said, her voice sharp. "My lawyers, Harvard graduates, reviewed this for months. You expect me to believe a waiter spotted a flaw in 20 seconds? Michael's expression did not shift, but his eyes held a glint of something unreadable, confidence perhaps, or defiance. "Not speculating," he said. "The clause allows them to keep your deposit for administrative costs, even if they cancel for reasons they control. In simple terms, they can legally take your money and run." Elizabeth's pulse hammered in her temples. She wanted to dismiss him, to call security and end this public farce, but a seed of doubt had taken root. Her lawyers, paid $400,000, had assured her the contract was ironclad. Yet Michael's words carried a clarity that cut through her certainty. She glanced at the contract, its pages now heavy with unspoken threats. "You are out of your depth," she said, but her voice trembled slightly, betraying her. James Peterson, the restaurant manager, hovered nearby, his face slick with sweat. He stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Mrs. Harper, I apologize for the disruption. Michael, please return to the kitchen." "Let us not escalate this further." Michael did not move. He held the contract like a shield, his posture relaxed but unyielding. "I am not escalating," he said, his voice low. I am answering Mrs. Harper's challenge. She asked me to translate the contract. I am doing exactly that. James hesitated, caught between his loyalty to the restaurant's reputation and the undeniable authority in Michael's tone. The diners watched, some now openly recording with their phones, their screens glowing like fireflies in the dim light. Elizabeth felt their eyes on her, each one a needle pricking her carefully crafted image. She leaned forward, her voice a hiss. Fine, keep going, waiter. Let us see how far this charade takes you. Michael flipped to the next page, his movements deliberate, as if he had memorized every word. Intellectual property clause, he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. The seller retains rights to any innovation developed jointly, even after the merger. He paused, letting the words sink in. Translation: anything your company creates with them, they can claim as theirs. Forever. They could use your own technology to compete against you. Elizabeth's stomach twisted. She had skimmed that clause, trusting her legal team's assurances that it was standard. Now, under Michael's scrutiny, it felt like a noose tightening around her empire. She opened her mouth to retort, but no words came. The room seemed to close in, the air thick with the scent of roasted garlic and her own rising panic. Across the restaurant, a woman in a silk dress whispered to her companion, her phone angled to capture the scene. The soft click of cameras and the rustle of fabric underscored the moment, amplifying Elizabeth's exposure. She straightened, forcing her voice to steady. You are cherry-picking phrases to sound clever, she said. This is a complex document. You cannot possibly understand its full context. Michael's lips curved into a faint smile, not cruel but unsettlingly assured. Context is my specialty, he said. I grew up watching contracts like this destroy people. My mother lost her business to a lease with a clause just like this one, vague enough to let the landlord double her rent overnight. I learned to read the fine print because no one else would. The confession hung in the air, raw and unexpected. For a moment, the diners' curiosity shifted to empathy, their gazes softening as they looked at Michael. Elizabeth felt the shift, her control slipping like sand through her fingers. She wanted to lash out, to reclaim the narrative, but Michael's calm was a wall she could not breach. James stepped closer, his voice urgent. Michael, please, you have made your point. Let us not ruin the evening for everyone. Michael glanced at him, then back at Elizabeth. I am not here to ruin anything, he said. I am here to show Mrs. Harper what her lawyers missed. The question is, does she want me to stop? His eyes locked onto hers, a challenge wrapped in composure. Elizabeth's breath hitched. She wanted to scream for him to leave, to banish this humiliation. But the doubt in her mind had grown into a chasm. What if he was right? What if her empire was teetering on the edge of a mistake she could not undo? She clenched her jaw, her voice barely above a whisper. Keep going. Michael nodded, turning the page with a slow, deliberate motion. Let us talk about the customer data clause, he said, his voice now carrying a quiet intensity. It allows the seller to access all your client information indefinitely, even after the merger. He looked up, his gaze piercing. In plain English, they can steal your customers and build a rival company with the data you paid $200 million to protect. The words landed like a physical blow. Elizabeth's face drained of color, her hands trembling as she gripped the table. The restaurant seemed to fade, the clink of glasses and hum of voices drowned by the roar of her own fear. Michael stood before her, a waiter no longer, but something far more dangerous, an adversary who saw through her armor and held the power to unravel everything she had built. The Meridian restaurant held its breath, the air thick with the scent of rosemary and the electric charge of confrontation. Chandeliers cast golden light across the faces of diners, their eyes fixed on Michael Carter, a waiter who had become something else entirely. The $200 million merger contract lay open in his hands, its pages heavy with secrets he was unraveling with surgical precision. Across the table, Elizabeth Harper sat rigid, her navy blazer a stark contrast to her ashen face. Her empire, built on ambition and control, teetered under the weight of Michael's words, and the room knew it. Michael's voice cut through the silence, steady and deliberate. "The customer data clause is not the only problem," he said, flipping to a later page with a flick of his wrist. Clause 17, Dispute Resolution. It grants the seller veto power over any future legal challenges. He paused, his dark eyes locking onto Elizabeth's. "In simple terms, if they betray you, you cannot fight back without their permission. They control your company's fate." A gasp rippled through the dining room, soft but audible. Diners leaned closer, their phones glowing as they recorded the unfolding drama. Elizabeth's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to dismiss him, to call his words lies, but the specificity of his critique was a blade too sharp to ignore. Her lawyers had missed this, just as they had missed the termination clause, the intellectual property trap, the customer data loophole. Doubt clawed at her, its roots sinking deeper with every clause Michael exposed. "You are making this up," she said, her voice low and trembling with barely contained rage. "You cannot possibly know this contract better than my legal team. Who are you?" Michael's expression remained calm, but a flicker of something, pain perhaps or resolve, crossed his eyes. "I am someone who learned to read contracts the hard way," he said. "When I was 12, my mother signed a loan agreement she could not understand. The bank took our home when she missed one payment. I spent years studying law to make sure no one else would lose what we did." His voice softened, but the weight of his words filled the room. "This contract, Mrs. Harper, is full of the same traps." The diner's murmurs grew louder, a mix of shock and admiration. A man in a tailored suit set down his wine glass, his eyes narrowing as he studied Michael. Elizabeth felt the shift in the room's energy, the tide turning against her. She was no longer the untouchable CEO. She was a woman exposed, her arrogance laid bare. Her throat tightened, but she forced her voice to steady. "You are a waiter," she said, spitting the word like venom. "Do not lecture me about my business." Michael's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "I am answering your challenge," he said. "You asked me to translate the contract. I am showing you what your lawyers missed, or perhaps they did not miss it. Perhaps they assumed you would not notice." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. Elizabeth's breath caught, her mind racing. Was it possible her legal team had been negligent, or worse, complicit? She had trusted them implicitly, their Harvard degrees and polished resumes a shield against her own insecurities. But Michael's knowledge was not theoretical. It was lived, forged in the crucible of survival. That realization chilled her more than the eyes of the diners or the glow of their phones. James Peterson, the restaurant manager, stepped forward, his face a mask of anxiety. "Michael, please," he said, his voice strained. "This is going too far." "Mrs. Harper is a valued guest. Let us end this now." Michael glanced at James, his expression softening briefly. "I respect you, James," he said, "but Mrs. Harper challenged me in front of everyone." "I am finishing what she started." He turned back to Elizabeth, his gaze unwavering. "Unless you want me to stop." Elizabeth's heart pounded, her pride warring with her fear. Stopping him would mean admitting defeat, but letting him continue risked further exposure. She glanced at the diners, their phones capturing every moment, and felt a surge of panic. This was no longer a private dispute. It was a public spectacle, and she was losing. "Go on," she said, her voice barely audible. "Show me how clever you think you are." Michael nodded, turning the page with a slow, deliberate motion. "Let us talk about the employment clause," he said. It requires Harper Technologies to retain all current executives of the seller for 5 years at their existing salaries. He looked up, his voice steady. In plain English, you are forced to keep their leadership even if they run your company into the ground. And one of those executives, Mrs. Harper, was fired from your company 3 months ago for misconduct. Kevin Thompson, my cousin. The room seemed to tilt, the air growing heavier. Elizabeth's face drained of color, her eyes widening as the name landed like a physical blow. Kevin Thompson, her former junior lawyer, dismissed for what she had called cultural incompatibility. She had written emails to Human Resources, framing his firing as necessary, but now those words felt like a noose tightening around her. That is irrelevant, she said, her voice shaking. This is about the contract, not personal grudges. Michael's eyes narrowed, his calm giving way to a quiet intensity. It is relevant, he said. Kevin sent me your emails, 47 of them, detailing why he was unfit for your company. Words like not a cultural fit, lacking corporate polish, coded language for something else. He paused, letting the implication hang. You fired him because of who he is, not what he did. And tonight, you assumed the same about me. The diner's whispers grew into a low hum, their phones angled to capture Elizabeth's reaction. A woman in a pearl necklace shook her head, her expression a mix of disgust and fascination. Elizabeth felt the weight of their judgment, her carefully crafted image crumbling. She wanted to scream, to deny it, but the truth in Michael's words was undeniable. She had judged him by his uniform, his role, his skin, just as she had judged Kevin. And now the world was watching. Michael closed the contract, his voice low but resonant. This contract is not just a bad deal, Mrs. Harper. It is a betrayal of your shareholders, your employees, and yourself. And it is built on the same prejudice that led you to challenge me tonight. He stepped back, his gaze steady. The question is, what will you do now? Elizabeth's hands trembled, her mind a storm of fear and defiance. She wanted to lash out, to reclaim control, but the eyes of the diners, the glow of their phones, and the unyielding truth in Michael's words held her captive. The restaurant, once a sanctuary of power, had become a stage for her unraveling, and Michael Carter, the waiter she had underestimated, was rewriting the script. The Meridian restaurant was a crucible, its opulent glow dimmed by the storm of revelations unfolding at Elizabeth Harper's table. The air thrummed with tension, the clink of silverware silenced as diners leaned forward, their phones capturing every word. Michael Carter stood tall, the $200 million merger contract in his hands, his voice a quiet blade slicing through Elizabeth's defenses. Her face, once a mask of arrogance, was now a canvas of shock and fear, her empire teetering on the edge of his words. The room waited, breathless, for what would come next. Michael closed the contract with a deliberate snap, his dark eyes fixed on Elizabeth. You challenged me to prove myself, he said, his voice low but resonant. But this is not about me. It is about your company, your shareholders, and the truth you refused to see because of who you thought I was. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I am not just a waiter, Mrs. Harper. I am Michael Carter, Harvard Law School, class of 2022, specializing in corporate mergers, and I have been watching you for weeks. Elizabeth's breath caught, her hands trembling as she gripped the table. The diner's murmurs swelled, a wave of shock rippling through the room. Phones angled closer, their screens glowing like stars in the dim light. Elizabeth's mind raced, replaying every moment of the evening, the contract, her outburst, her challenge. How had she missed this? How had a waiter outmaneuvered her? Before she could speak, a voice cut through the tension, calm and authoritative. He is absolutely correct. Heads turned as an older man rose from a corner table, his silver hair catching the chandelier's glow. He moved with the measured grace of someone accustomed to command, his tailored suit immaculate. The room seemed to shift, recognizing power in his presence. James Peterson, the manager, stammered, "Mr. Mitchell, I did not realize you were dining tonight." Robert Mitchell, legendary corporate lawyer and senior partner at Mitchell Associates, smiled faintly. "I was enjoying a quiet meal until this discussion became impossible to ignore." He approached Elizabeth's table, his eyes settling on Michael with a mix of pride and curiosity. "Young man, where did you learn to dissect contracts with such precision?" Michael took a deep breath, the moment of truth unfolding like a carefully planned chess move. "Mr. Mitchell, we have met," he said, his voice steady. "I was an intern at your firm 2 summers ago. I worked on the TechCorp merger, identifying 7 predatory clauses your senior staff overlooked. I believe you called me one of the sharpest minds you had seen." Robert's smile widened, a spark of recognition in his eyes. "Michael Carter," he said, nodding slowly. "Of course. Your analysis saved my client $80 million. I should have known you were not here by chance." He turned to Elizabeth, whose jaw had gone slack, her face drained of color. "Mrs. Harper, you have just challenged one of the brightest legal minds I have ever encountered, and it appears he has been preparing for this moment." Elizabeth's voice was a whisper, barely audible. This cannot be true." Her eyes darted between Michael and Robert, searching for a crack in the narrative, a way to reclaim control. But the truth was a weight she could not lift. The diner's phones recorded every second, their whispers now a chorus of astonishment. She was no longer the untouchable CEO. She was a woman exposed, her prejudice laid bare before a legend of the legal world. Michael stepped forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "I work at this restaurant because it belongs to my girlfriend's family," he said. "They needed help during a rough time, and I stepped in. But my real work has been with Hartwell Enterprises, the company you are trying to buy." He paused, letting the revelation land. "They hired me 6 months ago to analyze your operations, to find every vulnerability in this merger. Tonight was not an accident, Mrs. Harper. I knew you would be here reviewing this contract because you always dine here on Tuesdays at 8. Elizabeth's blood ran cold, her hands trembling uncontrollably. You planned this?" Her voice cracked, the room spinning as the implications sank in. She had walked into a trap, her arrogance the bait that had ensnared her. The diner's eyes bore into her, their phones capturing the moment her empire began to crumble. Robert Mitchell raised a hand, his voice professional but firm. "Mrs. Harper, there is no conflict of interest here. Michael never signed a confidentiality agreement with your company. He used public information and his expertise to identify flaws you should have seen. And you publicly humiliated him, assuming he was beneath you." He paused, his gaze piercing. "That was your mistake." Michael opened the contract again, his movements deliberate. "There is one more clause you need to know about," he said. "Page 47, data access. It allows Hartwell to retain your customer data indefinitely, even after the merger." He looked up, his voice steady. "In plain English, they can steal your clients and compete against you with the very information you paid $200 million to protect." Elizabeth's face went white, her hands clutching the contract as if it could anchor her. She flipped to page 47, her eyes scanning the text, and found the clause exactly as Michael described. Her lawyers had inserted it in the final revision, assuring her it was minor. Now, it was a dagger aimed at her company's heart. "You are lying," she whispered, but her voice carried no conviction. Robert shook his head, his tone almost pitying. "He is not lying, Mrs. Harper. I have seen clauses like this destroy companies. If Michael had not spoken tonight, you would have signed your legacy away." He turned to Michael, a glint of admiration in his eyes. "What is your plan now, young man?" "Because something tells me you are not improvising." Michael's lips curved into a faint smile, not cruel, but resolute. "My plan is simple," he said. "First, I will save Harper Technologies from a contract that would bankrupt it. Second, I will show the world how prejudice nearly cost you $200 million because you refused to listen to someone you judged by their appearance." He paused, his gaze locking onto Elizabeth's. "And third, I will make sure this moment teaches others what happens when you underestimate those you think are beneath you." The room was silent, the weight of Michael's words settling like ash. Elizabeth sat frozen, her empire unraveling before her eyes, her arrogance the spark that had ignited her downfall. The diner's phones glowed. Capturing the moment, a waiter became a titan, and a CEO learned the cost of her pride. The Meridian restaurant was a crucible of shattered illusions, its golden light now a stark spotlight on Elizabeth Harper's unraveling. The air was thick with the scent of truffle oil and the weight of 100 eyes, each diner's phone capturing the moment a waiter had become a reckoning. Michael Carter stood at the center of the storm, the $200 million merger contract in his hands, its pages a map of Elizabeth's missteps. Her face, drained of color, was a mask of desperation, her navy blazer creased from gripping the table. Robert Mitchell, the legendary lawyer, watched with quiet fascination, his presence amplifying the gravity of the scene. Michael's voice cut through the silence, steady and unrelenting. "This contract is a house of cards, Mrs. Harper," he said, his dark eyes piercing. 16 critical flaws, each one a threat to your company's survival. Your lawyers missed them or chose not to see them, but I did, because I have spent 6 months studying Harper Technologies for Hartwell Enterprises. He paused, letting the revelation sink deeper. "They hired me to expose your vulnerabilities, and tonight you handed me the stage to do it." Elizabeth's breath hitched, her hands trembling as she clutched the contract. The diner's murmurs grew louder, their phones glowing like a constellation of judgment. She wanted to scream, to deny the truth, but Michael's words were a tide she could not stem. "You cannot do this," she whispered, her voice raw. "This merger is 2 years of my life. If it fails, Harper Technologies will collapse." Michael's expression softened, a flicker of empathy crossing his face, but his resolve did not waver. "Your company will collapse if this merger goes through," he said. "The clauses I have shown you, termination, intellectual property, customer data, dispute resolution, they give Hartwell the power to dismantle you from the inside. You would lose not just $200 million, but control of everything you have built." Elizabeth's eyes darted to Robert Mitchell, searching for an ally, but his gaze was unyielding. "He is right, Mrs. Harper," Robert said, his voice calm but firm. "I have seen contracts like this ruin empires. Your legal team's negligence is staggering, and your refusal to listen tonight has only compounded the damage." He glanced at Michael, a nod of respect. "This young man has done you a service, whether you see it or not." The words stung, each one a crack in Elizabeth's armor. She felt the diner's eyes, the weight of their recordings, and the crushing realization that her legacy was slipping away. "You planned this," she said, her voice rising, a desperate edge to it. "You humiliated me on purpose in front of everyone. This is not about the contract, it is personal." Michael shook his head, his calm, unshaken. "It is not personal," he said. "It is justice. You humiliated me because you assumed I was nothing. You fired my cousin Kevin Thompson for the same reason. You built a pattern of prejudice, and tonight it caught up with you." He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. "I have documented everything. Your words, your insults, your refusal to listen. And I am not keeping it to myself." Elizabeth's blood ran cold, her eyes widening as Michael tapped his screen. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice trembling with panic. "I just sent an email to your board," Michael said, his tone even. A full analysis of the contract's 16 flaws, with copies to the Securities and Exchange Commission and 3 journalists who cover corporate mergers. The email went out at 9:15 tonight, to every board member, with evidence of the risks you ignored. He turned the phone to show her the sent confirmation, the timestamp glowing in the dim light. Elizabeth lunged for the phone, her hands shaking. But Michael stepped back, his movements calm and deliberate. "You cannot stop it," he said. "The board needs to know the truth. Your shareholders deserve to know why their company was nearly sold into ruin. And the world needs to see what happens when prejudice blinds someone to competence." The diner's gasps filled the room, their phones capturing the moment Elizabeth's empire crumbled. A man in a pinstripe suit whispered to his companion, his voice carrying, "She is finished." Elizabeth felt the words like a physical blow, her knees weakening as she sank back into her chair. The contract slipped from her hands, its pages scattering across the table like fallen leaves. James Peterson, the restaurant manager, approached nervously, his face pale. "Michael, please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is enough. Let us not destroy her completely." Michael glanced at James, his expression softening briefly. "I am not here to destroy her," he said. "I am here to save her company and show the world what prejudice costs. Mrs. Harper can still salvage this, but only if she listens now." He turned back to Elizabeth, his voice steady but not unkind. "Renegotiate the contract. Fire your legal team. And take a hard look at why you assumed I could not possibly know what I was talking about." Elizabeth's eyes burned with unshed tears, her pride warring with the truth. She wanted to fight back, to reclaim her authority, but the evidence was overwhelming. The diner's phones, Robert's presence, Michael's unassailable logic, they were a jury, and she had been found wanting. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why go this far?" Michael's gaze softened, but his resolve held firm. "Because someone has to," he said. "Because my mother lost everything to contracts like this, and I swore I would never let it happen again. Because prejudice like yours costs more than money. It costs lives, dreams, futures." He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And because the best way to fight it is not with anger, but with proof." Robert Mitchell stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "Mrs. Harper, you have a choice," he said. "You can double down on denial and lose everything, or you can listen to Michael, fix this contract, and rebuild. But the clock is ticking. The board has his email, the journalists have his evidence. What will you do?" Elizabeth sat motionless, the weight of her choices crushing her. The restaurant, once a sanctuary of power, was now a stage for her reckoning. Michael stood before her, a man she had underestimated, his calm a mirror to her chaos. The diner's phones glowed, capturing the moment a titan fell, and a new voice rose to take her place. The Meridian restaurant had become a memory, its golden chandeliers and marble floors fading into the city's pulse as the night's events rippled outward. 3 weeks had passed since Michael Carter, a waiter-turned-legal prodigy, had dismantled Elizabeth Harper's $200 million merger in front of a captivated audience. The viral videos, shared over 2 million times, bore headlines that seared into the public consciousness. CEO's prejudice costs empire, and Harvard lawyer disguised as waiter exposes corporate flaws. Harper Technologies teetered on the brink, and the fallout was merciless. Elizabeth sat alone in her corner office on the 30th floor, the Manhattan skyline a cold expanse beyond the glass. Cardboard boxes lined the room, filled with framed awards and personal effects, packed by security guards who avoided her eyes. The board had voted unanimously for her removal as CEO, their decision fueled by Michael's email, a 16-point indictment of the merger contract's flaws and her legal team's negligence. The story had spread like wildfire. amplified by the restaurant videos and the damning emails Michael had uncovered, exposing her pattern of prejudice. Contracts with key partners had been canceled, citing incompatible values, and her reputation, once a fortress, lay in ruins. She stared at a photo on her desk, a younger version of herself shaking hands with a tech pioneer at her first startup launch. That woman had been fearless, driven by a hunger to prove herself in a world that doubted her. Somewhere along the way, that hunger had twisted into arrogance, a need to control that blinded her to others' worth. Michael's words echoed in her mind. The best way to fight prejudice is not with anger, but with proof. She had underestimated him, and the cost was everything. Yet in the quiet of her office, a flicker of resolve stirred. She was not finished. Not yet. Across the city, Michael Carter stood in a modest office space, its walls still smelling of fresh paint. The sign outside read, "Carter Law, Justice for Small Businesses," a dream born from the ashes of that night at the Meridian. The viral videos had brought him 47 job offers, including a senior counsel position at Hartwell Enterprises and a junior partnership at Robert Mitchell's prestigious firm. But Michael had chosen a different path, accepting funding from a group of investors inspired by his story. His firm already had a waiting list of 300 clients, small business owners who saw in him a champion against predatory contracts. Michael adjusted his tie, his reflection sharp in the office window. At 25, he carried the weight of his mother's sacrifices, her stroke during his bar exam, a wound that had shaped his choices. He had failed the exam by mere points, choosing her care over his own ambitions. But the Meridian had given him a new stage. His cousin, Kevin Thompson, stood beside him, organizing files for their first case. Kevin had received an $800,000 settlement from Harper Technologies after Michael's evidence, Elizabeth's discriminatory emails, proved racial bias in his firing. With the funds, Kevin had finished law school and joined Michael's firm as its first employee. "Feels unreal, doesn't it?" Kevin said, his voice warm as he sorted contracts. 3 weeks ago you were pouring coffee. Now you are a legend." Michael smiled, but his eyes were distant. "I am not a legend," he said. "I am just someone who saw a chance to make things right." He thought of Elizabeth, her face pale with shock as he sent the email to her board. He had not wanted to destroy her, only to expose the truth. Yet the fallout had been brutal, and a part of him wondered if she would find a way to rise again. The merger between Harper Technologies and Hartwell Enterprises had collapsed. Independent auditors, prompted by Michael's analysis, confirmed the contract's flaws, and Hartwell withdrew, citing governance risks. Harper Technologies survived under new leadership, but Elizabeth lost 90% of her shares to settle with furious investors threatening lawsuits. The financial hit was staggering, but the public shame cut deeper. Executive headhunters stopped returning her calls, and when she landed a role at a smaller firm, diversity consultants shadowed her every move, a constant reminder of her fall. Robert Mitchell, now Michael's mentor, often recounted the Meridian story in his lectures, framing it as a cautionary tale of unconscious bias. "In 30 years, he would say, I have never seen anyone spot so many contractual flaws so quickly, nor have I seen arrogance cost so much so fast." His words carried weight, and Michael's reputation grew, his firm a beacon for those the system had overlooked. Back in her office, Elizabeth packed the last of her belongings, her fingers lingering on a worn notebook from her early days. She had been a coder then, solving problems with logic and grit. The Meridian had exposed her flaws, but it had also awakened something she had buried, a desire to rebuild, not for power, but for redemption. She had contacted a nonprofit focused on diversity in tech, offering her expertise as a volunteer. It was a small step, but it felt like a beginning. Michael's lesson had been harsh, but it was also a mirror, showing her who she could become if she chose to change. Michael, too, was reflecting. He sat at his desk, reviewing a contract for a client, a family-owned bakery facing an exploitative lease. The work was personal, a continuation of the fight he had begun as a boy, protecting his mother from predatory systems. The Meridian had been a turning point, but it was not his victory alone. It was Kevin's, his mother's, and every client who trusted him to fight for them. He glanced at a framed photo of his mother, her smile radiant despite her illness, and felt a quiet strength settle in his chest. The city hummed beyond the office window, its lights a tapestry of stories yet to be told. Elizabeth and Michael, divided by their choices, were bound by a single night that had changed them both. The fallout was complete, but the seeds of redemption and purpose had been planted, waiting for time to reveal their growth. The Meridian restaurant had become a memory, its golden chandeliers and marble floors fading into the city's pulse as the night's events rippled outward. 3 weeks had passed since Michael Carter, a waiter-turned-legal prodigy, had dismantled Elizabeth Harper's $200 million merger in front of a captivated audience. The viral videos, shared over 2 million times, bore headlines that seared into the public consciousness: CEO's prejudice costs empire, and Harvard lawyer disguised as waiter exposes corporate flaws. Harper Technologies teetered on the brink, and the fallout was merciless. Elizabeth sat alone in her corner office on the 30th floor, the Manhattan skyline a cold expanse beyond the glass. Cardboard boxes lined the room, filled with framed awards and personal effects, packed by security guards who avoided her eyes. The board had voted unanimously for her removal as CEO, their decision fueled by Michael's email, a 16-point indictment of the merger contract's flaws and her legal team's negligence. The story had spread like wildfire, amplified by the restaurant videos and the damning emails Michael had uncovered, exposing her pattern of prejudice. Contracts with key partners had been canceled, citing incompatible values, and her reputation, once a fortress, lay in ruins. She stared at a photo on her desk, a younger version of herself shaking hands with a tech pioneer at her first startup launch. That woman had been fearless, driven by a hunger to prove herself in a world that doubted her. Somewhere along the way, that hunger had twisted into arrogance, a need to control that blinded her to others' worth. Michael's words echoed in her mind. The best way to fight prejudice is not with anger, but with proof. She had underestimated him, and the cost was everything. Yet in the quiet of her office, a flicker of resolve stirred. She was not finished. Not yet. Across the city, Michael Carter stood in a modest office space, its walls still smelling of fresh paint. The sign outside read, "Carter Law, Justice for Small Businesses," a dream born from the ashes of that night at the Meridian. The viral videos had brought him 47 job offers, including a senior counsel position at Hartwell Enterprises and a junior partnership at Robert Mitchell's prestigious firm. But Michael had chosen a different path, accepting funding from a group of investors inspired by his story. His firm already had a waiting list of 300 clients, small business owners who saw in him a champion against predatory contracts. Michael adjusted his tie, his reflection sharp in the office window. At 25, he carried the weight of his mother's sacrifices, her stroke during his bar exam, a wound that had shaped his choices. He had failed the exam by mere points, choosing her care over his own ambitions. But the Meridian had given him a new stage. His cousin, Kevin Thompson, stood beside him, organizing files for their first case. Kevin had received an $800,000 settlement from Harper Technologies after Michael's evidence, Elizabeth's discriminatory emails, proved racial bias in his firing. With the funds, Kevin had finished law school and joined Michael's firm as its first employee. "Feels unreal, doesn't it?" Kevin said, his voice warm as he sorted contracts. 3 weeks ago you were pouring coffee. Now you are a legend. Michael smiled, but his eyes were distant. "I am not a legend," he said. I am just someone who saw a chance to make things right. He thought of Elizabeth, her face pale with shock as he sent the email to her board. He had not wanted to destroy her, only to expose the truth. Yet the fallout had been brutal, and a part of him wondered if she would find a way to rise again. The merger between Harper Technologies and Hartwell Enterprises had collapsed. Independent auditors, prompted by Michael's analysis, confirmed the contract's flaws, and Hartwell withdrew, citing governance risks. Harper Technologies survived under new leadership, but Elizabeth lost 90% of her shares to settle with furious investors threatening lawsuits. The financial hit was staggering, but the public shame cut deeper. Executive headhunters stopped returning her calls, and when she landed a role at a smaller firm, diversity consultants shadowed her every move, a constant reminder of her fall. Robert Mitchell, now Michael's mentor, often recounted the Meridian story in his lectures, framing it as a cautionary tale of unconscious bias. "In 30 years, he would say, I have never seen anyone spot so many contractual flaws so quickly. Nor have I seen arrogance cost so much so fast." His words carried weight, and Michael's reputation grew, his firm a beacon for those the system had overlooked. Back in her office, Elizabeth packed the last of her belongings, her fingers lingering on a worn notebook from her early days. She had been a coder then, solving problems with logic and grit. The Meridian had exposed her flaws, but it had also awakened something she had buried. A desire to rebuild, not for power, but for redemption. She had contacted a nonprofit focused on diversity in tech, offering her expertise as a volunteer. It was a small step, but it felt like a beginning. Michael's lesson had been harsh, but it was also a mirror, showing her who she could become if she chose to change. Michael, too, was reflecting. He sat at his desk, reviewing a contract for a client, a family-owned bakery facing an exploitative lease. The work was personal, a continuation of the fight he had begun as a boy, protecting his mother from predatory systems. The Meridian had been a turning point, but it was not his victory alone. It was Kevin's, his mother's, and every client who trusted him to fight for them. He glanced at a framed photo of his mother, her smile radiant despite her illness, and felt a quiet strength settle in his chest. The city hummed beyond the office window, its lights a tapestry of stories yet to be told. Elizabeth and Michael, divided by their choices, were bound by a single night that had changed them both. The fallout was complete, but the seeds of redemption and purpose had been planted, waiting for time to reveal their growth. Manager laughed at the janitor. "You think you belong here?" Then he opened his mouth and stunned everyone.